Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have some specific questions, but just a quick note on Mr. Posey's comments. Part of the frustration I think most Americans have, as well as the people that were defrauded here, is the fact that there hasn't been enough punishment. Accountability is one thing, and there's the responsibility within our government agencies to follow through, and those people need to be removed if they can't do the job. And one of the big explanations that has come forward on this problem is the fact that there weren't enough people, at least in my view, of providing regulation. The quality of people, many over the years were pushed out, and bad decisions were made. Mr. Markopoulos is a perfect example of the fact that information was presented. This should have been shut down a long time ago, yet people didn't make decisions, and those people need to be punished. But there's a second line on this that goes into the private sector. And I don't think personally that there's enough punishment, criminal punishment, for people that break the laws and defraud the American public. Part of it comes down to Mr. Madoff. Yeah, sure, he's in prison. He couldn't have done this by himself. I just can't accept that. I mean, there's too many other people involved in this process, and there needs to be swift punishment. I agree with that. That sends a very strong message. But let's get to the specifics here. Thank you for your testimony, both as individual investors and as professionals, to give your thoughts on this. One of the problems that I see is that there seems to be some inconsistency in interpretation by the SEC and the SIPC. One of the things that I said before is, people need to know that on the website or in the door that SIPC symbol means something. The investor public needs to know that it means something. And if we look back at the original language in SIPC series rules, and there's a federal regulation 300.500, it says the rules provide for the classification of claims in accordance with the, quote, legitimate expectations, close quote, of a customer based upon the written transaction confirmations sent by the broker-dealer to the customer. Seems pretty obvious to me. Did you get a statement? Was it a reasonable expectation that your statements, one after the other, look like any other statements you got from Merrill Lynch or anybody else? I think the answer is probably yes. There probably weren't any big signals going the other way. So again, I think this is this set of expectations that you all had in this process. One of the interpretations, I guess I'll ask Ms. Chaitman this question. One of the interpretations the SEC seems to be talking about, based on this lack of precedent, is that there's no case law that really talks about the fact that the interpretation should be that if an investor told a broker to purchase specific securities, that seems to be a very clear case where the SIPC can come in and fund. But if you didn't have that specific line of securities requested, and most of us go into a broker and there's a sort of a risk assessment of, I want some bonds and some this and some growth and everything else, that doesn't seem to be covered. Ms. Chaitman, do you have a thought on what the SEC's view and why that doesn't seem to make sense?
Well, the first I learned of the SEC's position was last evening when I saw their written testimony. And I have to tell this body that there is no authority in the statute for the SEC's position. In other words, you can read SIPA from beginning to end, from the first word to the last word, and nowhere does it say that the full protections of this statute are reserved for customers who make their own investment decisions, but not for customers who rely upon financial advisors. And if you analyze the economics of what the SEC is suggesting, instead of protecting investors, which is what we as taxpayers fund them to do, they are protecting the industry-funded insurance company, because the vast majority of Americans don't make their own investment decisions. My clients are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. They don't have the capacity to decide whether they should buy something one day and sell it the next day. They hire financial advisors, and they go to brokers who make those decisions for them. They invest through Fidelity or Vanguard, and they buy funds, and those fund managers make investment decisions for them.
Is it your view that if this interpretation were held up, and this was the SEC's interpretation throughout, that it would seem to me that millions of investors who just give a more general parameter of investment authority to an investment house may not be covered by a failed account, a failed broker who the SIPC steps in on?
Precisely, they wouldn't be covered for the full 500,000. And the purpose of the statute was to instill confidence in the capital markets. If the FDIC tomorrow, in the next bank liquidation, decided, you know what, we don't insure the accounts except for the net investment, so we're eliminating all interest that may have accumulated over the last 30 years, and we're only going to pay the net deposit, there would be a run on the banking system. And the SEC's filing yesterday for this committee could create a run on the securities firms, because no investor in this country has any idea what kind of coverage they have in the event that they're dealing with a dishonest broker.
Professor Coffey, you had a comment about zero-sum game would be changed if the SIPC assessed its members to provide for the coverage. You made I agree with your comment that it's illusory in the amount of actual cash in the bank. Would you say, sir?
I congratulate this committee because you are raising the assessment from 150 to 0.2%.
Well, it seems to me, Professor Coffey, that one of the problems here is there's a certain amount of money, and we're sort of backing our coverage into that amount of money, as opposed to creating.
It's underfunded. You're quite right.
Right. The law is the law, and if it happens to be underfunded, then there ought to be an assessment or some way of making the people whole. Not say, well, it's not $500,000 because we don't have enough cash in the bank to make this thing whole. And again, I just go back to how important it is, how strategic and essential it is for the public to know that if they invest, that the money, there is a fund there to protect them if there's fraud, insolvency, and those things out there.
I think you're quite right. I want to make one little comment. To the extent that you raise the amount of assessment that the brokerage industry has to pay, you will also give them an incentive through organizations like FINRA to cut back on risky behavior by brokerage firms such as Mr. Madoff. Right now, they have no interest in stopping Mr. Madoff from being a cowboy and doing what he's doing. But if they have to pay higher assessments and the prospect of higher payouts will raise those, then they'll have an interest in controlling the outliers within the brokerage community.
And Mr. Chairman, just to conclude, again, my view of this is let's follow the law. If the protection is there, the $500,000 protection is there, those people should be given that full $500,000. The clawback, we've already been through this discussion. Nobody's looking for $8 to $10 million back, and if they are, it's not reasonable. But the SIPC has a responsibility, and the SEC has a responsibility to make sure the law is followed correctly.